I got an email earlier after my comments about having a discussion with this 22-year-old Asad Niaz off air this morning. That's the young bloke who's in strife as a security guard, currently in quarantine and currently facing 2 fines for disregarding instructions and going to Burwood Westfield and then going to Services New South Wales to renew a licence. I got an email from Daniel Lukovic, who's a security expert with a company called Calamity, and Daniel wants to have a yarn with me. He's on the line. G'day, Dan.
Ray, thanks for having me on. Ray, the security industry's got a serious problem, and at the moment, it's getting a lot of daylight because of predominantly what's happened in Victoria, and to some extent what's happened in Sydney. Now, to most people within the security profession, and it's something I've been involved with for several decades, none of this has come as any surprise. Right. The problem is that bad security is like bad insurance. When nothing happens and all you do is you pay the check each month, you don't realise you have a problem. But when something goes wrong, that's when you suddenly realise that absolutely nothing worked. And this is not about the hotel quarantine stuff up or about any particular company or any particular guard, but it's actually about a prolific issue right across the security industry nationally, which represents a threat to national security and absolutely needs to be addressed. Now, let me explain perhaps the background to why you ended up talking to a guard in a serious life safety role who, as you pointed out, is of poor English. Right now, we have hundreds of thousands of Australians who are out of work. The security industry traditionally was an excellent employer because it is work that is available in every town in the entire country. It is work that's available 24 hours a day. Smart, educated, hardworking people, which is what I once was, should be flooding that industry. But unfortunately, what's happened over the last decade or so is security has essentially become a job of last resort, in many cases for people who traditionally might have gone into, say, the taxi industry, which has been decimated. It attracts a lot of new migrant labour, and these are all good people. They're very hardworking, and many of them work 2 or 3 jobs. But the problem is that, there's a certain job driving a taxi or becoming a cleaner or working in a factory where if your English isn't so good or you're not that well educated or you fall asleep on the job, it's not going to have any serious ramifications. Once you go into the security industry, it's a very different problem. Now, if we look at what happened, what was dropped at the hotel quarantine inquiry in Victoria yesterday, there was a guard who was a subcontractor to another subcontractor to a head contractor in Melbourne. So there was the first problem. And while he was working at the hotel, he noticed, this is a security guard, he noticed that he was having a few of the sniffles, and he mentioned it to someone who said, it's probably nothing, everyone here seems to have a cold. Now, you know exactly what those sniffles represented. He left. He then went back to his migrant enclave where he lived with 3 other people who work in security and in food delivery. They were tested positive, and the rest and everybody who's sitting on the couch in Victoria at the moment is paying for that. Now, as I said on air to Peter Credlin a few weeks ago, this was an entirely predictable stuff-up, and I said at the time, when you have guards from small communities of poor education, poor English and poor ability to follow instructions, and you put them in a dangerous position, things like this are absolutely predictable. Now, it's a shame that the whole security industry will get panned for this, and you have some, comments about we should be using police, we should be using army.
Well, Daniel, let me interrupt. You've had a fair whack. Okay, let me interrupt there. Okay, interrupt. It's very simple, Dan. And I said at the time, there are obviously professional security guards who do a good job, and I run into a lot of them when I might go to my local pub. Okay, but at the end of the day, your industry, not mine, is a bit like the trucking industry at the moment. Okay, There are places in Western Sydney and places in Brisbane where blokes who can barely drive a small sedan sit in the cabin of a truck and are given a licence and then can't back the B-double into a loading dock. But they're given a licence by some cowboy outfit who get government money to make sure these people get a licence. And that's what's happening with security firms at the moment. There are people who can't... Don't worry about him being restricted. He couldn't speak English, the bloke, mate. And the company he purports to represent, say on their website, you've got to have oral and written skills in English, superior oral and written skills. Now, what the problem is with your industry is it needs a rattle-up. And it needed a rattle up a long time before COVID-19. You cannot give people, you want to pay $22 an hour, a job simply because they want a job. they've got to have some expertise in dealing with the people they've got to deal with, whether it be someone at the front of a pub, someone in a supermarket, or someone in some other capacity where security is required. And what you've got at the moment, and that's why I'm calling in the coppers, mate, what you've got at the moment is a whole range of 22-year-old Asardini Azers across hotels in Sydney that wouldn't know their backside from their elbow when it comes to security. And it doesn't matter whether I'm offending some people in the security industry or not, Daniel. We are in a crisis situation. We don't want to be Victoria, where the people down there just did whatever they did. They, in some cases, allegedly had sex with some of the people in some of the rooms, came into contact with them, and as you said, the rest is history. But
Ray, I'm not offended by most of what you're saying, and in fact, I'm in agreement with a lot of it. And I mean, your comparison to truckies is a very good one, because what's happened over the last 10 years is, once upon a time, truck drivers learned how to drive a truck and they knew how to drive a truck. Now we have an entire industry around training. And there are parallels in the security industry as well. Once upon a time, there was some well-intentioned bureaucrat who thought, let's lift standards by increasing training. And so what they actually did was they made it more costly and harder for, educated, hard-working people to get into that job. So they'd find other workers, traffic controllers or forklift drivers and whatever. And instead, you'd be attracting a certain type. Now, look, this problem in the security industry is not going to be solved quickly, and there have been a number of us who've actually been saying that we now need a royal commission into the security industry. Because, Ray, one thing you've got to remember, you're hearing about the stuff up at the hotels. What you're not hearing about is the next stuff up by the same sort of companies at airports, at shopping centres, at football stadiums. So it's not about the hotels or that particular contract. It's right across the industry. And unfortunately, we've been banging our heads against a brick wall, those of us who actually care about quality, because, look, if it's not on the front pages, ministers aren't interested. The last time the security industry was in the spotlight was when David Hooks got bashed to death by a bouncer, which was an isolated incident probably a decade ago. This is at least getting some daylight onto a problem that has national security ramifications. And what we actually need is a royal commission and buy-in from ministers. I mean, some of the other problems is that every state marches to the beat of their own drum. So, for example, in New South Wales, you have to be a permanent resident or a citizen to obtain a security licence, which means there's quite a bit of probity checking that goes into it. Whereas in Queensland, they specifically prohibit the use of criminal intelligence, which means that a terrorist could get a licence to work in security.
We're not going to get a Royal Commission, mate, in the middle of a pandemic. But we'll agree on this. Daniel, I'll leave you here. Something needs to be done. In the short term, we can't have security guards like the young bloke, I'm not blaming him entirely, 22-year-old Asardini Az, guarding people who're supposed to be in quarantine when he doesn't know what quarantine means, he doesn't know what the virus means, and he can't obey instructions to go home and stay there as opposed to go to Burwood, Westfield and the Services New South Wales. You're not going to get a Royal Commission, Daniel. You're not going to get it. There's that many Royal Commissions inquiries happening at the moment, you won't get into this industry. In the short term, we need Gladys Berejiklian and, if necessary, any other Premier thinking about using security to think again, because the thing is a basket case. You can't use security like the 22-year-old I'm talking about here because things get buggered up. And we can't have any more buggering up, as we've seen. And in relation to, I'll leave you there, that's Daniel Lukowitz from Calamity Security. But a security guard was given explosive evidence to the Victorian Hotel Quarantine Inquiry, saying he was told to hide potentially infected masks and gloves in his pocket to cover up a lack of personal protection equipment at Bridges in Melbourne. The man is potentially the patient zero. That's the one Daniel spoke about, patient zero, who, of course, went home and infected other people, and the rest, as they say, and Daniel said, is history. But in the meantime, there'll be no Royal Commission into the security industry, Daniel, but what we need in the short term is these people not to be put in positions of authority because they're simply not up to it. Then we can start talking about the training in New South Wales, in Victoria and Queensland, and what's necessary to make sure the right sort of people get into that industry. It's 21 to midday.